The air in the Arizona desert doesn't just sit. It vibrates with the ghost of a low, rumbling bass frequency that hasn't been heard in the flesh for over 2 decades. At 82, Jessi Colter sits in a room where the shadows stretch like long, dark fingers across the fretboard of the piano. She hasn't the heart to dust. To the world, she was the queen of outlaw country, the woman who tamed the wild stallion of American music, Waylon Jennings. But as she stares into the lens of the camera, her eyes aren't reflecting the gold records on the wall. They're tracing the cracks in a marriage that was as much a battlefield as it was a sanctuary. The silence between them in those final years was louder than any stadium roar, a heavy, suffocating veil of secrets and unspoken apologies. Why, after 24 years of quiet, has she finally chosen this moment to strip away the myth? As she leans forward, the leather of her chair creaking like a saddle, she prepares to reveal the one truth about Waylon that she promised to take to her grave, a truth that changes everything we thought we knew about the man in black. The dust motes dance in a single shaft of amber light, mocking the stillness of the house. Jessi Colter is 82 years old, and her hands, though spotted with the passage of 8 decades, still possess the delicate grace of a woman who played hymns before she played honky-tonks. She sits in the center of the frame, the silence of the Arizona hills pressing against the windows like a physical weight. To look at her is to see a map of a shared life. There is a specific kind of loneliness that belongs only to the widows of icons. It is a crowded isolation, populated by the ghosts of fans, the echoes of bass lines, and the suffocating scent of old leather and tobacco that never quite leaves the curtains. For 24 years, Jessi has played the role of the dignified silent partner, the graceful bridge to a bygone era of country music rebellion. But beneath the poise, a storm has been brewing. The room is heavy with Waylon. His hats sit on pedestals like crowns of a fallen kingdom. His Telecaster rests in its case, a sleeping beast. Jessi's mind wanders to the late 90s, to the nights when the bravado of the outlaw had faded into the raspy breathing of a man who knew his time was short. She remembers the way he would look at her, not as a star, but as a drowning man looks at the shore. She has kept his secrets like a hoarded treasure, fearing that the truth would tarnish the bronze statue the world built of him. She reflects on the internal pressure of identity. Was she ever just Jessi? Or was she always the and in Waylon and Jessi? The guilt of wanting to speak, of wanting to be seen for her own scars, battles with the fierce loyalty that defined their marriage. She describes the lighting of the room shifting as the sun sets, the shadows growing longer, mirroring the deepening of her resolve. The psychological weight of carrying another person's legacy is a debt that never gets paid off. They think they knew him, she whispers, her voice a low vibration that cracks the stillness. They think he was iron, but iron snaps if you freeze it long enough. She stands up, her joints protesting with a faint sound that seems amplified in the hushed room. She walks toward a small, mahogany desk in the corner, a piece of furniture Waylon was never allowed to touch. Her fingers trace the edge of a small, brass key hidden beneath a lace coaster. She looks directly into the lens, the reflection of the camera visible in her pupils. He told me to wait until the world forgot what a real man looked like, she says. I think we've waited long enough. As the key turns in the lock with a metallic click that echoes like a gunshot, Jessi pulls out a stack of yellowed letters, tied not with a ribbon, but with a piece of guitar string. The top letter is stained with what looks like dried blood. Before the stage lights, there was the sun of Phoenix, and before the whiskey, there was the wine of the Eucharist. Miriam Johnson, the girl who would become Jessi, was raised in the white-hot heat of Pentecostal fervor, where the world was divided into the saved and the damned. The transition from the church piano to the recording studio was a descent into a beautiful, terrifying underworld. When she met Waylon, he wasn't yet the bearded king of the outlaws. He was a clean-shaven, restless soul carrying the survivor's guilt of a plane crash that took Buddy Holly, but spared him. Jessi describes the psychological magnetism of his trauma. She saw the opening wound in him, a deep-seated fear that he was living on borrowed time, which drove him to live at a pace that would kill a normal man. The cinematic focus shifts to a smoky studio in 1969. The air is thick with the smell of burnt coffee and cheap menthol cigarettes. Waylon stands in the booth, a silhouette of nervous energy. Jessi watches him from the glass, feeling the tectonic plates of her morality shift. She was the preacher's daughter, and he was the storm. She recalls the early days of their romance, not as a series of dates, but as a series of rescues. She was constantly pulling him back from the edge of professional suicide and personal collapse. The psychological pressure was immense. She became his conscience, a role that slowly began to erode her own sense of self. She describes a night in a cheap motel in Nashville where the reality of his addiction first bared its teeth. The sensory details are vivid. The flickering neon sign outside casting a rhythmic blue light over Waylon's sweating face as he paced the room, his eyes wide with a paranoia she didn't understand. He wasn't the man on the album cover. He was a frightened boy trapped in a legend's body. Jessi speaks of the hidden loneliness of that period. Even when they were the it couple of Nashville, she felt like she was standing on a pier, watching him drift further into a fog of pills and ego. She tried to be the anchor, but the rope was fraying. "I thought love was a shield," Jessi says, her voice echoing in the present-day room. "I didn't realize that sometimes love is just a witness to the fire." She picks up one of the yellowed letters from the desk. It's a note Waylon wrote her from a jail cell in 1970, and the contents reveal a pact they made, a pact that Jessi is about to break for the very first time. Success is a heavy coat, and by the mid-70s, the coat was made of lead. The outlaw movement had turned Waylon Jennings into a god, but gods are rarely allowed to be human. The scene shifts to the height of the 1970s. The screen is filled with the sensory overload of tour buses, screaming crowds, and the constant, thumping heartbeat of the bass guitar. But Jessi's narrative pulls us into the back of the bus, into the shadows where the cameras didn't go. She describes the peak fame era not as a triumph, but as a psychological prison. Waylon felt trapped by the very image he had created. He had to be the toughest, the loudest, the most rebellious. Jessi recounts the internal pressure he felt to live up to the Waylon myth, a pressure that led to a $1,500 a day cocaine habit. She speaks with brutal honesty about the major downfall phase, not a single event, but a slow crumbling. She describes the lighting in their home during those years as perpetual twilight, because Waylon couldn't stand the brightness of the day. There was a deep darkness of guilt. He knew he was failing her, and that knowledge made him lash out. Jessi reflects on her own isolation. She was the queen, but her throne was a chair next to a telephone, waiting for a call that he was dead or arrested. The psychological depth of this chapter explores the quiet war within their marriage, the moments when they didn't speak for days, the air between them thick with the things they were both too afraid to say. She recounts a specific night in 1977 when Waylon, at the height of his powers, broke down in the kitchen and wept because he couldn't remember the last time he felt happy. The cinematic tension builds as Jessi describes the deep darkness phase. The drugs had stripped away his spirit, leaving only the outlaw shell. She had to decide whether to leave to save herself or stay and potentially bury him. People saw the leather and the long hair, Jessi says, her eyes narrowing as she looks at a photograph of them from that era. They didn't see the man who was terrified that if the music stopped, he'd disappear. She pauses, her breath hitching. "There was a night," she continues, "when he held a gun to his own head. And he told me why he was doing it. It wasn't because of the drugs. It was because of a secret Nashville had been keeping for him since 1965. The end doesn't come with a bang. It comes with the soft hiss of an oxygen tank and the smell of sterile hospital sheets." The final years of Waylon Jennings were a slow retreat from the battlefield, a time of reckoning that Jessi has never fully shared, until now. The narrative moves into the rebirth and legacy phase. After the chaos of the 70s and 80s, the 90s brought a forced sobriety and a confrontation with a failing body. Jessi describes the psychological shift from being his protector to being his nurse. The outlaw was gone, replaced by a man who spent his days looking out at the Arizona landscape, reflecting on a life of purpose and regret. Jessi's voice becomes more intimate, more fractured. She speaks of the deep darkness of the final months. Waylon's leg was amputated due to diabetes, a symbolic stripping away of the man who once stood so tall. She explores the theme of identity again. Who was Waylon Jennings without his stance, without his stride? She recounts their final conversations, the quiet war having finally ended in a peaceful surrender. They spent hours talking about the afterlife, about the people he had hurt, and the long-form storytelling of his own life that he wanted her to eventually correct. She reveals that Waylon's biggest fear wasn't death, but being remembered as a caricature, a rebel without a soul. He gave her permission to tell the truth, but she has waited 24 years to find the courage. She describes the sensory details of his final hour, the golden light of the desert afternoon, the sound of his favorite record playing softly in the background, and the way his hand felt, suddenly light, as if the lead coat of fame had finally been lifted. The psychological depth here is profound. She isn't just mourning a husband. She is mourning the only person who truly knew the girl behind the Jessi Colter mask. Jessi leans back, the stack of letters now resting in her lap. The weight seems to have lifted from her shoulders. She has finally bridged the gap between the myth and the man. He wasn't an outlaw, she says, a small, sad smile touching her lips. He was just a man who was afraid of the dark, and he spent his whole life trying to light enough fires to keep it away. I'm just the one who's left to sweep up the ashes. She picks up the final letter, the one with the guitar string. The world thinks he died with no regrets, she says, opening the envelope. But he left me one last mission. A name. A person he spent 30 years trying to find, but never did. And today, I'm going to tell you who that person is.